He made her stand. In a private dining room lined with glass and quiet money, Hudson Hale asked his wife to pour wine again. Not for guests, for the woman seated in Caroline's chair. Caroline's hands were steady despite the illness he had dismissed all week. Around them, executives watched without speaking. Some lowered their eyes, others didn't. Lydia Pierce smiled as if this had always been the natural order of things. Hudson called it hospitality. Caroline said nothing, because the only person in that room who didn't need permission was her. If you've ever seen power mistaken for noise, stay with this story. Before we continue, take a moment, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and it reminds me how far these stories travel. And if you believe dignity doesn't always announce itself, consider subscribing, not for me, but for stories that remember. People often believe they understood the marriage between Caroline Hale and Hudson Hale because it was easy to explain from the outside. He was the visible one. Hudson Hale had the kind of presence that filled rooms before he entered them. His voice carried authority without effort. His handshake lingered just long enough to suggest confidence, not desperation. In photographs, he leaned slightly forward, as if always moving towards something greater. Business magazines described him as self-made, a word he never corrected. She was the quiet one. Caroline Hale stood beside him in those same photographs, composed, precise, almost forgettable to those who didn't know what to look for. Her posture was never accidental. Her expression rarely invited questions. She did not compete with his presence. She allowed it to expand, uninterrupted. This many assumed was the dynamic. But what people see is often shaped by what someone else has already decided they should notice. Caroline had learned that early. She had also learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, was not absence. It was position. Their marriage had not always been like this. There had been a time years ago, before the company had a name recognizable enough to open doors, when Hudson still listened. Back then, he spoke quickly, ideas spilling over each other, impatient with the limits of reality. Caroline had not interrupted him. She had organized him. Where he imagined, she structured. Where he accelerated, she stabilized. Where he risked, she calculated. There were nights when they sat across from each other at a small kitchen table long before private dining rooms and curated guest lists, reviewing documents line by line. Hudson would skim. Caroline would read. Not just the words, the implications, the conditions hidden in phrasing, the obligations that appeared harmless until they were activated. She had never needed to raise her voice to be heard then. He would pause mid-sentence when she placed a finger on a clause and said quietly, "This part matters." He used to trust that. Trust her. But success, when it arrived, did not arrive evenly. It settled differently on each of them. For Hudson, it confirmed something he had already begun to believe, that he had always been destined for it, and that the rest had simply been timing. For Caroline, it revealed something else entirely, that success attracts attention, and attention rewards performance more than truth. Hudson adapted quickly to that reality. He learned what to say in interviews, how to compress complex histories into clean narratives. He became fluent in selective memory. The company's origin story shifted gradually over time, not through lies, but through omissions that hardened into fact. Caroline did not correct him, not publicly, not even privately after a certain point, because she had begun to understand something more useful than correction: documentation. While Hudson spoke, Caroline recorded, not in obvious ways. There were no dramatic gestures, no hidden devices, just habits. Emails archived, meeting notes saved, drafts preserved, dates aligned, patterns recognized. She did not collect moments. She collected consistency. It was a quieter discipline than confrontation, and far more durable. Over time, the distance between them did not announce itself with arguments. It revealed itself in what no longer needed to be said. Hudson stopped asking her opinion on decisions that carried weight. He asked for approval on things that had already been decided. Caroline stopped offering unsolicited insight, not because she had less to say, but because she had learned exactly when it would matter and when it wouldn't. The first time Lydia Pierce appeared in their orbit, she did not arrive as a disruption. She arrived as an accessory, an introduction at a networking event, a name mentioned twice in passing, a presence that seemed to attach itself to Hudson's schedule with increasing frequency. Lydia understood rooms in a different way than Caroline did. Where Caroline observed patterns, Lydia read reactions. She knew when to laugh half a second after a joke never before. She knew how to ask questions that allowed men like Hudson to expand into themselves. She listened just long enough to mirror interest, then redirected attention back to the person she needed something from. Her ambition was not hidden. It was refined. There were women in those circles who pretended not to want proximity to power. Lydia never made that mistake. She wanted it. She reached for it. And she did so with a precision that made it appear effortless. Hudson noticed. Of course he did. Men like him always noticed those who reflected them back at a slightly more flattering angle. At first, Caroline treated Lydia the same way she treated everything else she watched. There were dinners where Lydia's name came up too often. Meetings that ran longer than necessary. Trips that required extended stays for reasons that did not fully align with the agendas presented. None of it was explicit, but none of it was invisible either. Caroline did not ask questions, not because she didn't know, but because she didn't need confirmation to understand direction. What changed was not the presence of Lydia. It was Hudson's behavior. There was a subtle shift in how he addressed Caroline in private, a slight impatience that hadn't existed before, a tone that suggested interruption even when she hadn't spoken. He began to correct her in front of others, not aggressively, but casually, as if adjusting a detail that had been misplaced. Small things, almost unnoticeable, unless you were the one being repositioned. Caroline noticed. She also noticed who else did. Assistants who hesitated before speaking to her. Colleagues who redirected questions toward Hudson, even when she had been the one to answer them for years. Invitations that became more formal, less personal. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It erodes, and erosion leaves traces. Caroline followed those traces the way she followed everything else methodically. She paid attention to timing, to language, to repetition. She began to see the outline of something that had not yet been declared. And she adjusted accordingly, not outwardly. Outwardly, she became what they expected her to become. Quieter, more distant, easier to overlook. It was a role she understood well enough to perform convincingly, because the less they saw, the more they revealed. Her health began to decline around the same time. At first, it was fatigue she could not fully account for. Then came the appointments, the tests, the kind of medical conversations that replace certainty with careful language. Hudson attended the first appointment. He asked the right questions. He placed a hand on hers in the waiting room. He performed concern the way he performed everything else, with precision. But performance requires energy and attention, and both of those were increasingly directed elsewhere. By the time the diagnosis became something that required ongoing management rather than temporary adjustment, Hudson had already reframed it. Not as a crisis, but as an inconvenience. He never said that directly. He didn't need to. It was in the way he checked his phone during follow-up discussions, in the way he scheduled around her treatment rather than adjusting for it, in the way he described her condition to others, minimized, softened, made manageable. Caroline did not argue. She adapted. She scheduled her appointments without asking. She followed medical instructions with the same discipline she applied to everything else. She documented symptoms, reactions, timelines. Control for her had never been about dominance. It had always been about clarity, and clarity required record. The night of the dinner, the one that would later be discussed in rooms far quieter than that one, began like any other obligation Hudson considered non-negotiable. There will be investors, he said. standing near the doorway of their bedroom, already dressed. "You should be there." It was not a request. Caroline sat at the edge of the bed, her movements slower than they had once been, but not uncertain. "I'm not well tonight," she said. It was a statement, not an appeal. Hudson exhaled, not impatiently, but with a kind of practiced restraint. "It's important," he replied. "Appearances matter. Appearances." Caroline looked at him then, and not searching for something, but confirming something she had already understood. He needed her there. Not as a partner, as a symbol. "I'll be ready," she said. And she was. Not quickly, not dramatically, but completely. As she dressed, she moved with intention. Each choice fabric-colored detail was considered not for how it would be seen, but for how it would hold. She did not prepare for an evening. She prepared for a moment that had already begun. On her phone, a notification appeared. A message from Margaret Ellis. Just a name, no urgency, no explanation. Caroline looked at it for a few seconds longer than necessary. Then she locked the screen. Not yet. Some things required timing. And Caroline Hale had never been early. Illness, when it settles into a life, does not arrive as a single event. It rearranges time. For Caroline Hale, it did not begin with a diagnosis. It began with interruptions, small, almost dismissible moments, when her body refused to follow the rhythm she had maintained for years. A pause halfway up a staircase. A delay in focus while reading a document she would normally process in seconds. A fatigue that sleep did not correct. At first, she adjusted quietly. She moved meetings. She shortened calls. She shifted responsibilities without announcing that anything had changed. There was no need to create concern where none would be useful. But the body, unlike a contract, does not negotiate indefinitely. Eventually, it required acknowledgement. Doctors spoke carefully. They used language that suggested control while admitting uncertainty. Treatment plans were structured but conditional. Progress would be measured but not guaranteed. Caroline listened the same way she always did, without interruption, without visible reaction, absorbing not just the information, but the tone beneath it. She asked precise questions. Not about fear, about timelines, about side effects, about what could be predicted and what could not. Hudson sat beside her during the first consultation, his presence composed, attentive in the way expected of a husband in such a setting. He nodded at appropriate moments. He asked questions that sounded responsible. What does recovery look like? What should we expect in the next few months? The doctor answered in measured terms. Caroline did not correct the assumptions embedded in those questions. Recovery was not a guarantee. Expectation was not certainty. But correcting language in that moment would not change the outcome. It would only shift the performance. And Caroline had no interest in performance. After the appointment, Hudson suggested dinner, not out of insensitivity, but out of habit. Difficult moments in his world were followed by normalcy, as if continuity itself could erase disruption. Caroline declined. "I'd prefer to go home," she said. He accepted that without argument, at least at first. In the weeks that followed, the structure of their lives adjusted around her condition, but not equally. Caroline adapted internally. Hudson adapted externally. He ensured that her schedule did not interfere with visible obligations. He spoke of her health in controlled language to colleagues. Nothing serious, just monitoring. "She's fine, really." He believed, perhaps sincerely, that minimizing the situation made it manageable. Caroline understood something else. Minimization does not reduce reality. It only delays confrontation with it. Her days became more deliberate. She tracked everything: medication schedules, physical responses, variations in energy. She wrote them down, not out of anxiety, but out of discipline. Patterns mattered. They always had. If something changed, she would see it. If something repeated, she would understand it. Hudson noticed the adjustments, but not the method behind them. To him, Caroline appeared quieter, slower, more withdrawn. He interpreted this as weakness. It was not. It was conservation. Energy redirected toward what could still be controlled. There were moments, brief, almost accidental, when Hudson's patience thinned. He did not express it directly. It showed in smaller ways. A glance at his watch when she moved too slowly. A sigh he did not fully suppress. A conversation cut short because he had something urgent to attend to. Urgency, Caroline observed, had become increasingly selective. It rarely aligned with her. More often, it aligned with Lydia Pierce. Lydia's presence in Hudson's life had shifted from incidental to integrated. Her name appeared in conversations without context. Her schedule overlapped with his in ways that required no explanation because none was offered. Caroline did not ask, again not because she didn't know, but because knowledge did not require acknowledgement to exist. One evening, as Caroline reviewed a series of archived emails, routine, methodical, she noticed something small. An expense report, approved quickly, categorized vaguely. The amount itself was not unusual, but the frequency was. Repeated entries, similar descriptions, different dates. She traced them. Not immediately. She let them sit. Patterns reveal themselves more clearly when not forced. Days later, she returned to them, aligning dates with Hudson's travel schedule. The overlap was precise, not accidental. Caroline saved the files, not as evidence, not yet, as reference. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. A message. Margaret Ellis, again. This time there was a single line beneath the name. We should speak when you're ready. Caroline read it once. Then again. Margaret Ellis was not someone who sent messages without purpose. Their history extended beyond casual acquaintance. Margaret had been present in earlier stages of Caroline's life, legal consultations that had required discretion, foresight, and a level of trust not easily given. If Margaret was reaching out twice, it was not routine. It was timing. Caroline placed the phone face down. She was not avoiding the conversation. She was sequencing it. There were still variables she needed to observe. Hudson entered the room without knocking, already dressed for the evening. There's a dinner tomorrow, he said, adjusting his cuff as he spoke. Private, important. Caroline did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was reading, closed the document, and then turned toward him. How many people, she asked. Selective group, he replied. Investors. A few board-adjacent guests. And Lydia, Caroline asked. It was not a confrontational question. It was a factual one. Hudson paused just briefly. She'll be there, he said. No elaboration, no justification. Caroline nodded once. Hudson watched her for a moment, as if expecting a reaction that did not come. You should come, he added. It would look better. There it was again. Appearance. Not concern. Not companionship. Presentation. Caroline held his gaze, not challenging, not yielding. I have a treatment scheduled that afternoon, she said. You can move it, Hudson replied, almost reflexively. This is important. Important. The word carried weight in his world. But weight, Caroline knew, was relative. She considered the timing, the dinner, the message from Margaret, the patterns she had begun to trace. The way Hudson framed necessity. I'll attend, she said. Hudson relaxed, slightly satisfied. Good, he said. It matters. He left the room as quickly as he had entered, already shifting his attention elsewhere. Caroline remained where she was. Still, quiet. Then she reached for her phone again. This time, she opened the message. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before she typed a response. Soon. She did not send it immediately. She read it once, adjusted nothing, then sent it. The reply came faster than expected. I'll be ready. Caroline set the phone down. Across the room, her reflection in the window caught her attention not as a mirror, but as a silhouette. There was no visible sign from that distance of what her body was managing. No indication of fatigue. No evidence of strain. Only stillness. Controlled, measured. She stood slowly, not because she was weak, but because she refused to rush. Tomorrow would not be an ordinary evening, not because of who would be there, but because of what had already begun to align. Caroline walked to her closet and began selecting what she would wear. Each choice was deliberate, not for impression, for endurance, for clarity, for presence. She was not preparing to be seen. She was preparing to witness. The dining room had been designed to remove uncertainty. Glass walls framed the skyline in controlled angles, turning the city into something curated rather than alive. Light reflected softly across polished surfaces, cutlery aligned with mathematical precision, crystal arranged to suggest effortlessness. Nothing in the room was accidental. Not the seating, not the spacing, not the hierarchy. Caroline noticed all of it the moment she entered. Hudson was already inside, positioned near the center of the room, speaking to a small cluster of guests. His posture was open, confident, calibrated for admiration. When he saw her, he did not approach immediately. He finished his sentence first, allowed the laughter to settle, then turned. "Caroline," he said, as if acknowledging a detail that had arrived on time. There was no gesture of affection, no adjustment in tone, only recognition. She moved toward him with measured steps, her expression unchanged. The room shifted subtly as she crossed it, conversations pausing for half a second longer than usual, eyes following, recalibrating. They were assessing her, not her presence, her condition. Caroline could feel it in the way people looked without appearing to look. In the slight narrowing of attention, the quiet calculations. Was she well enough? Was she stable? Was she relevant? Hudson placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, not guiding, not supporting, but positioning. "Everyone," he said, turning slightly, "you remember Caroline. Remember, not meet, not welcome, remember." Names followed, faces, titles. Caroline responded with brief nods, precise eye contact, nothing excessive. She did not perform warmth. She acknowledged existence. Then she saw Lydia, seated, at the head-adjacent position that should have belonged to Caroline. Lydia Pierce did not stand. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture that balanced between politeness and possession. Her dress was carefully chosen, elegant, without competing, noticeable, without appearing deliberate. She looked comfortable, not as a guest, as someone already integrated. "Caroline," Lydia said, her voice smooth, unhurried. "It's good to see you." Caroline held her gaze for a fraction longer than necessary. "Is it?" she replied softly. There was no sharpness in the tone, only clarity. Lydia smiled, as if the answer did not matter. Hudson moved quickly to fill the space. "Let's sit," he said. "We're just getting started." They took their places, or rather, they were assigned them. Caroline noticed immediately that her seat had shifted. Not removed, repositioned. One place down, slightly offset from the center axis of the table. Close enough to remain visible, far enough to redefine her role. Hudson sat across from Lydia, not beside his wife. Conversation resumed with the ease of practiced professionals. Market trends, expansion strategies, regulatory shifts. Language designed to signal competence without revealing vulnerability. Caroline listened, not to the content, to the alignment. Who deferred to whom? Who interrupted? Who waited? Patterns formed quickly. Then, halfway through the first course, a small disruption was introduced. A server approached Hudson quietly, leaning in just enough to be discreet. Hudson frowned slightly. "Short-staffed tonight," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. Unfortunate. It was a simple statement, an observation, but it carried intention. He turned his head just enough. "Caroline," he said, his tone light, almost amused. "Could you help with the wine?" The table stilled. Not visibly, but perceptibly. A shift in attention. A recalibration. Caroline did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, out of timing. Hudson held her gaze, a faint expectation settling into his expression. It was not a request. It was a test. Caroline placed her napkin carefully beside her plate. Then she stood. Her movement was steady, controlled. No sign of strain despite the quiet resistance in her body. She reached for the bottle nearest her and moved along the table. One glass at a time, measured pours, no spill, no tremor. The room watched, some with discomfort, others with curiosity, a few with something closer to approval, because power, when misused, publicly reveals more about the observers than the act itself. Caroline noticed who spoke to her, who avoided her eyes, who thanked her, who didn't. Then she reached Lydia. Lydia's glass was already half full. She extended it anyway. Just a little more, she said, smiling. Caroline looked at the glass, then at Lydia, then poured, exactly as requested, no more, no less. Thank you, Lydia added. Caroline inclined her head slightly, not submissive, not defiant, precise. Across the table, Hudson watched. There was satisfaction in his expression, not overt, but present. He leaned back slightly, one arm resting along the back of Lydia's chair, not touching, but close enough to suggest proximity. Conversation resumed. But it had changed, subtly, irreversibly. Caroline returned to her seat. She did not rush. She did not reclaim space. She sat exactly where she had been placed, and observed. Richard Cole, seated 2 places down, did not look away when their eyes met. There was something there. Recognition, not of her condition, of the situation. He had seen enough boardrooms to understand imbalance when it presented itself outside formal settings. Caroline held his gaze for a second, then moved on. Because one witness was not a strategy, it was a variable. The evening progressed, courses changed, conversations deepened, wine levels dropped and were refilled by staff this time. Hudson grew more relaxed, more expansive. His hand rested more openly near Lydia's. Their proximity became less subtle, more assumed. At one point, he laughed genuinely and placed his fingers briefly over hers. It lasted less than a second. But it was enough. Enough for those watching, enough for those recording, enough for those who would later remember. Caroline saw it. Of course she did. But she did not react, because reaction would have reduced the moment, turned it into emotion. And emotion in rooms like this was easy to dismiss. What remained when emotion was removed was fact, documentable, repeatable, defensible. As dessert was served, Hudson glanced toward her again. Could you? He began gesturing lightly toward an empty glass at the far end. He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Caroline stood once more, not because she accepted the role, but because she understood the moment. She moved again along the table. Slower this time, not from weakness, from intention, every step observed, every action recorded not just by devices, but by memory. When she reached the final glass, she paused, just briefly, then poured. And in that pause so small, it could be dismissed as nothing. Something shifted, not in the room, in the structure beneath it. Because Caroline Hale was not being diminished. She was mapping every look, every silence, every act that would later require explanation. When she returned to her seat for the last time that evening, she did not look at Hudson. She did not look at Lydia. She looked at the table, at the arrangement, at the order that had been imposed. And she understood with complete clarity that nothing in that room would remain arranged that way for long, long before the glass walls, before the curated lighting and deliberate hierarchies of rooms like the one. Hudson now occupied so easily there had been a smaller space. A kitchen. Not large, not particularly modern. The kind of place where decisions were made without witnesses and consequences were not yet distributed across departments or diluted through committees. It was there that the company had first existed, not as an entity, but as a sequence of choices. Hudson remembered those years as momentum. Caroline remembered them as structure. He had spoken often of the idea, expansion, scalability, market gaps, language that moved quickly, always forward. He had believed in growth before there was anything tangible to grow. Caroline had believed in sustainability, not as a limitation, as a condition for survival. The first capital infusion had not come from venture interest or strategic partnerships. It had come quietly without announcement through a line of credit that Hudson had not secured on his own. Caroline had arranged it. Not by asking, by preparing. She had reviewed financial institutions that offered flexibility under conditions most founders ignored. She had identified risk exposure points, anticipated collateral requirements, and structured the application in a way that reduced rejection to a procedural formality. Hudson had signed where indicated. He had trusted the outcome. At that stage, trust still existed between them, not as sentiment, but as function. When the first contracts were drafted, Hudson focused on terms that accelerated acquisition speed, flexibility, competitive positioning. Caroline focused on language that endured. Termination clauses, control thresholds, default triggers. She had learned early that contracts were not about agreement. They were about contingency. Every document she reviewed carried a question beneath it. What happens when this fails? Hudson did not ask that question. He asked, what happens when this succeeds? Neither question was wrong. But only one accounted for both outcomes. The legal structures began simply. Then gradually they layered. A holding entity not for visibility, but for insulation. A trust established under conditions that seemed distant at the time, almost unnecessary. Voting rights distributed in a way that appeared balanced on paper, but resolved differently under activation. Caroline never explained these structures in full, not because Hudson wouldn't understand, but because he didn't ask. And in business, as in most things, what is not questioned often becomes invisible. Years passed, revenue stabilized, then expanded. Recognition followed. With it came investors, advisors, board members, each adding complexity, each requiring clarity that was often more performative than functional. Hudson adapted to them. He learned how to speak in ways that satisfied expectation. He simplified narratives, streamlined explanations, presented growth as inevitability. Caroline adjusted differently. She reviewed every new agreement against the original structures she had put in place. Nothing replaced them. Everything built around them. The company, as it appeared, publicly evolved. The foundation did not. There were moments when the difference between perception and reality came close to the surface. A board inquiry that touched on ownership percentages. A due diligence request that required documentation beyond summary. In those moments, Caroline provided what was necessary. Never more, never less. Enough to satisfy, not enough to reveal. Hudson came to believe over time that the company had outgrown its early dependencies. That whatever had been required in the beginning had been replaced by scale, by recognition, by his own capacity to lead. He was not entirely wrong, but he misunderstood sequence. Scale does not replace structure, it rests on it. And structure, once embedded correctly, does not disappear. It becomes invisible. Caroline allowed that invisibility. It was in many ways the most efficient form of control. There were no confrontations, no declarations, no moments where she asserted authority, because authority, when secured properly, does not need to be asserted. It needs to be maintained. She maintained it through habit, through review, through an attention to detail that did not diminish as the company grew, but refined itself. Every annual filing, every amendment, every expansion into a new jurisdiction. She read them. Hudson signed them. The pattern continued. And with each iteration, the distance between who appeared to own the company and who actually controlled it widened quietly without friction, until it became complete. Not in a single moment, but through accumulation. By the time the company reached the level where private dining rooms became routine, the structure was no longer fragile. It was fixed. Control, as defined in the documents that mattered, did not align with titles displayed on office doors. It aligned with provisions, with thresholds, with clauses that remained dormant until conditions activated them. Hudson had never needed to see those conditions, because until recently they had not been relevant. Caroline had never needed to reference them, because until recently there had been no reason to. That changed gradually, not with a single decision, but with a shift in behavior. Hudson began to operate as if authority was absolute. Not in the early years then, he had deferred where necessary. Later, he assumed. Approved expenditures without review. Authorized expansions that required deeper structural alignment than he recognized. Committed resources based on projections rather than secured positions, Caroline observed. Not critically, not emotionally, systematically. She reviewed the decisions after they were made, not to correct them, to understand them. And when patterns began to emerge, financial movements that did not align with stated purpose allocations that lacked transparency, she did not intervene immediately. She documented. Because intervention without record creates conflict. Documentation without intervention creates leverage. It was during one of these reviews that Lydia Pierce's presence first appeared in a way that extended beyond social context. Not as a name in conversation, as a line in a ledger, an expense categorized under client development. Then another, travel, accommodation, recurring, subtle at first, then consistent. Caroline did not assume. She verified. Dates aligned with Hudson's schedule. Locations matched. Amounts varied just enough to avoid immediate attention. But patterns once established do not disappear when disguised. They deepen. Caroline saved the records. Not separately, within existing systems, where they belonged. Nothing hidden, nothing highlighted, simply present. She understood something that Hudson did not. That misuse when repeated becomes traceable, and traceability when aligned with structure becomes decisive. She did not confront him, because confrontation would have shifted the matter into dispute, and dispute introduces interpretation. Caroline preferred clarity. Clarity supported by record required no interpretation. It required acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in the right setting becomes unavoidable. By the time Hudson asked her to attend the dinner, the one he framed as important for appearances, the company was no longer in a state where behavior could be dismissed as isolated. It had accumulated, quietly, consistently, completely. Caroline understood that the dinner was not the beginning of anything. It was a point along a line that had been forming for years, a visible moment, in a structure that had already been defined. As she closed the final document that evening, the one detailing a series of expenditures that connected more clearly than Hudson likely intended, she paused. Not out of hesitation, out of recognition. Everything she needed to understand was already in place. The company, the structure, the records, the timing. Hudson believed he was in control. Lydia believed she was ascending. The board believed they understood the organization they governed. Each belief was supported by what they could see. Caroline did not rely on what could be seen. She relied on what had been written, and what had been written years before anyone thought to question it did not change simply because no one remembered it clearly. Control once established with precision does not announce itself. It waits. Until the moment it is required. The aftermath of the dinner did not arrive with noise. There were no immediate confrontations, no raised voices echoing through hallways, no dramatic exits that could be recounted with certainty. Instead, it unfolded the way most consequential shifts do inside structured environments, quietly through channels that were designed to contain disruption rather than display it. On Monday morning, the company resumed its routine. Emails were sent. Meetings were scheduled. Deadlines remained unchanged. But beneath that continuity, something had shifted. Not in policy, in perception. The first indication came through human resources. An internal note categorized, carefully marked as confidential. A concern raised regarding executive conduct during a corporate-hosted private event. The language was neutral, deliberately so. It described behavior without assigning motive-listed observations, without interpretation. There were no names in the subject line, but within the body the references were clear enough. A second note followed, then a third. Not identical, not coordinated, but aligned. Different witnesses, different perspectives, same event, same discomfort. HR did not escalate immediately. That was not how the system worked. Concerns were logged, reviewed, assessed for pattern. Pattern determined response. and pattern this time formed quickly. Caroline knew this before anyone told her. Not because she had access to internal HR communications, she did not need it. Because she understood behavior. What had happened in that room had not been subtle enough to disappear. People do not forget discomfort when it is witnessed collectively. They compartmentalize it. Then, when given the appropriate channel, they release it. Caroline did not initiate those channels. She did not need to. She had only created the conditions for them to activate. At home, the atmosphere remained controlled. Hudson moved through the house with the same efficiency he applied to his professional life. Calls in one room, emails in another. Conversations conducted in low tones, always just out of reach of full clarity. Caroline noticed the timing. He was home less, present even less than that. When they did occupy the same space, interaction was minimal, functional. "Did you speak to the doctor?" he asked one evening, not looking up from his phone. "Yes," Caroline replied. "And it's ongoing." Hudson nodded, as if the answer aligned with expectations. "Good," he said. "Good. Not because of improvement, because it required no adjustment." Caroline did not correct him. There was nothing in that exchange that required expansion. She returned to her work, not work in the conventional sense, not meetings or visible responsibilities. Her work had always been quieter. She opened her laptop and began reviewing archived correspondence. Years of communication, structured, categorized, searchable. She filtered by sender, by date, by subject, not looking for something specific, looking for alignment, patterns across time. Hudson's language had changed gradually. Early emails, collaborative, inclusive. "We should consider. Let's review. What do you think?" Later emails directive. Proceed, approve, move forward. Recent emails assumptive. As discussed, already aligned, handled. The shift was not unusual. Authority often reshapes communication. But Caroline was not measuring tone. She was measuring consistency, where language diverges from documentation, discrepancies form. Discrepancies, when repeated, become evidence. She marked several threads, not flagged, not highlighted, simply noted, across the city in a board office that maintained its own rhythm, independent of daily operations. Richard Cole reviewed the same event from a different perspective. He had attended hundreds of corporate functions, seen excess, seen ego, seen behavior that skirted propriety without crossing into consequence. What he had witnessed at the dinner was not excess. It was misjudgment, public, unnecessary, and, more importantly, observable. Richard did not react immediately. He did what experienced board members do. He waited, not for resolution, for confirmation. When the HR summaries reached his desk, sanitized, structured, stripped of emotion, he read them carefully. Then he requested clarification, not formally, a conversation. "Was this isolated?" he asked. The answer, as it often is, was cautious. Concerns are being reviewed, which meant no, which meant pattern. Back at the house, Caroline closed one set of documents and opened another. Financial summaries, expense reports, authorization trails. She aligned them with calendar entries, with travel records, with the patterns she had already identified. Nothing new, only clearer. Her phone vibrated. "Margaret Ellis." This time Caroline answered. "Margaret." Margaret's voice was steady, unchanged by time. "I wasn't sure when you'd respond. I needed to review a few things first," Caroline said. A brief pause. "Of course," Margaret replied. "And now?" "Now I'd like to proceed." Margaret did not ask what that meant. She understood. "Documentation?" she asked. "Yes." "Control structures?" "Yes." Timing, Caroline looked at the screen in front of her, at the records, at the alignment. "Soon," she said. Another pause. "Then I'll prepare everything," Margaret replied. No urgency, no pressure, just readiness. They ended the call without formality. Caroline set the phone aside. Across the room, Hudson entered mid-conversation on his own phone. "No, we'll handle it internally," he was saying. "It's nothing." Nothing. He ended the call and glanced at her. "Some noise from the other night," he said. "HR will deal with it." Caroline met his gaze. "Will they?" she asked. Hudson smiled slightly. "They always do. Confidence, not based on review, on assumption." Caroline nodded once, then returned her attention to the documents. Hudson watched her for a moment longer than usual. There was something in her stillness that did not align with his expectation. But he did not question it. He had stopped questioning her some time ago. And what is not questioned remains to him understood. Lydia, meanwhile, had begun to adjust her position. The dinner had not unsettled her. If anything, it had clarified opportunity. Visibility had increased. Association had been confirmed. She began appearing more frequently in spaces adjacent to Hudson's professional life. Not formally introduced, but present. Lunches extended. Meetings followed by informal discussions. Staff noticed. Of course they did. Organizations observe more than they report. Caroline noted that as well. Not Lydia's presence, the response to it. Shifts in behavior, in deference, in assumption. All of it added to the same structure, the same pattern, the same accumulation. That evening, as the house settled into quiet, Caroline reviewed one final set of records. Then she closed her laptop. Not because she was finished, but because the next step did not require more review. It required action, measured, documented, irreversible. In another part of the city, Richard Cole drafted a request for a formal review. Not an accusation, a process, structured, necessary. He did not yet know the full extent of what he would uncover, only that something had moved beyond what could be dismissed. And once that threshold is crossed, systems do not retract. They proceed. Caroline stood moving slowly through the dim light of the room. Not weakened, deliberate. Everything was aligning. Not by chance, by sequence, by record, by time. And time, once it gathers enough weight, does not wait for permission. The office Margaret Ellis maintained did not rely on appearance to establish authority. It was not designed to impress. It was designed to endure. Located on a quiet street that carried less attention than the glass towers downtown, the building held its age without apology. Inside, the air felt still not stagnant but deliberate. Files were not decorative. Shelves were not curated. Everything had purpose. Caroline arrived on time. Not early, not late. Margaret was already seated when she entered a stack of documents arranged in front of her with a kind of order that did not require explanation. "Caroline," she said, standing just enough to acknowledge presence, not ceremony. "Margaret." They did not embrace. They did not exchange pleasantries. Their history did not require rehearsal. Margaret gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit," she said. Caroline did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret observed her, not her condition, not her appearance, but her composure. "You've reviewed everything," Margaret said. "Yes." "And you're certain you want to proceed?" Caroline held her gaze. "I want it to be accurate." Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Accuracy," she repeated. "Not retaliation?" "No." Margaret allowed the silence that followed to settle fully before she reached for the first document. "Then we'll proceed accordingly." She slid a folder across the table. Caroline opened it. Inside, the architecture of the company existed not as narrative, but as structure. Ownership distributions, trust agreements, holding entities layered across jurisdictions in ways that appeared complex until understood and then revealed themselves as precise. Margaret spoke without embellishment. "You retain controlling interest through Hale Strategic Holdings," she said, indicating the relevant section. "The voting rights are consolidated under conditions already met." Caroline read without interruption. "The triggers?" she asked. "Activated," Margaret replied. "Gradually over time. There was no single event. It accumulated." Caroline nodded. That aligned with her understanding. Margaret continued. "Hudson's position as CEO remains operational, not structural. His authority exists because it has not been formally challenged. Not because it's absolute," Caroline said. "Correct. Margaret paused, then added, "He believes it is." Caroline turned the page. "Belief doesn't alter documentation," she said. Margaret allowed a brief, almost imperceptible shift in expression, something close to approval. "No," she said, "it doesn't." A second file was placed on the table. "Forensic review," Margaret said. "Preliminary. Ethan will walk you through the details." As if on cue, the door opened quietly and Ethan Brooks entered. He carried a laptop, not a folder. His presence was less formal, but no less precise. "Caroline," he said with a nod. "Ethan." They had not worked together directly before, but their roles had intersected through documentation. He took the seat beside Margaret and opened his laptop, turning the screen slightly so both women could see. "I focused on alignment," he began, "not anomalies. Patterns are more reliable." Caroline watched the screen as data populated dates, amounts, categories. "Initial observation," Ethan continued, "is consistent reclassification of expenses. Nothing overt. But frequency creates visibility." He clicked and the data shifted into a timeline. "These entries," he said, pointing, "are categorized as client development." Another click. "Same dates align with travel records not associated with clients." Another. "Locations correspond with residential leases not registered under company assets." Caroline followed without comment. Margaret glanced at her briefly. "You recognize the name?" Ethan asked. Caroline did not need to look closely. "Yes," she said. Lydia Pierce. Ethan confirmed. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The data spoke clearly. "Amounts are controlled," he continued. "Individually, they don't trigger internal thresholds. But collectively, they establish intent," Caroline said. Ethan nodded. "Exactly." He moved to another screen. "Email correspondence supports this," he said. "Language suggests awareness of categorization, not oversight." Caroline leaned slightly forward. "Forward or reply?" she asked. "Forward," Ethan said. "Internal instruction." He opened one. Hudson's name appeared. The message was brief. "Reclassify under development. Keep it consistent. No explanation, no justification. Just direction." Caroline read it once, then again. "Not for content, for placement." "Timestamp?" she asked. Ethan indicated the corner of the screen. Caroline noted it, aligned it mentally with the other data she had already reviewed. It fit. Of course it did. Margaret closed the folder in front of her. From a legal standpoint, she said, this establishes more than misuse. It establishes pattern and intent. Caroline sat back. "And Lydia?" she asked. Margaret answered without hesitation. "Not primary liability," she said, "but not insulated." Ethan added, "Her benefit is documented, directly and indirectly." Caroline nodded once. No reaction, no judgment, just acknowledgement. Margaret folded her hands. "The question now is sequence," she said. "Corporate or personal first?" Caroline considered that, not as a choice between paths, as a matter of timing. "Corporate," she said. Margaret did not ask why. She understood. Corporate action establishes record. Personal action follows. "Then we prepare for board engagement," Margaret said. "Formal review." Ethan closed his laptop. "I'll finalize the report," he said. "Clean. Defensible." Caroline looked at both of them. "Preservation?" she asked. "Already initiated," Margaret replied. "Internal and external," which meant nothing could be altered without record, which meant everything from this point forward would be fixed. Caroline stood. The meeting for her was complete. Margaret remained seated. "Caroline," she said. Caroline paused. Margaret's tone shifted slightly, but enough to register. "This will not be quiet," she said, "even if you are." Caroline met her gaze. "I don't need it to be quiet," she replied. "I need it to be correct." Margaret held her eyes for a moment longer, then nodded. "That we can do." Outside, the air felt colder than it had that morning, not because the temperature had changed, because context had. Caroline walked without urgency. Her pace remained measured, her posture unchanged. Inside, nothing had escalated. No voices had been raised. No decisions had been announced. But everything had shifted, not in appearance, in structure. Hudson, at that same hour, was in a conference room several floors above the city speaking about expansion, growth projections, market positioning, future strategy. He moved through the presentation with confidence, uninterrupted, certain. Lydia sat at the edge of the room, not formally included, but present enough to be seen. She watched him the way she always did, with focus, with alignment, with the assumption that proximity would become permanence. Hudson glanced at her once. Briefly. It was enough. For her. For those who noticed. For the narrative that had begun to form around them. Caroline did not need to be in that room to understand it. She already had. Because what mattered was not what was being said. It was what had already been written. And written, when done correctly, does not require repetition. It requires recognition. That would come. Not through confrontation, through process, structured, documented, inevitable. Caroline reached her car and paused before opening the door. Not from hesitation, from awareness. The next steps would not depend on interpretation. They would depend on sequence. And sequence, once initiated, does not pause for reconsideration. She opened the door and stepped inside. The city moved around her as it always had. Unaware, unchanged. But within the systems that governed it, legal, financial, institutional, something had already begun to adjust. Not visibly, not yet, but precisely. And precision, when aligned with time, does not miss. Evidence does not arrive fully formed. It accumulates, not loudly, not dramatically, but through repetition. Small entries, consistent patterns, details that mean nothing in isolation and everything when aligned. Caroline understood that better than most. By the time Ethan Brooks sent the first finalized report, she had already anticipated its structure. Not the formatting, not the presentation, but the logic beneath it. The way facts, when arranged correctly, do not argue. They settle. She opened the file late in the evening, the house quiet, except for the distant, intermittent hum of Hudson's voice in another room. A call, another one. There had been many lately. She read the report once without interruption. Then again, more slowly. Ethan had organized the findings into 3 sections: classification discrepancies, financial flow alignment, and behavioral correlation. Clean, direct, unembellished. Under classification discrepancies, the entries were listed chronologically, expenses labeled under categories that, while technically permissible, did not match their actual function. Nothing illegal in isolation, nothing immediately actionable, until repetition was introduced. The second section made that repetition visible. Financial flow alignment connected the entries to specific dates, locations, and external records. Lease agreements, travel confirmations, vendor logs, individually accessible, collectively revealing. Lydia Pierce's name appeared not as an accusation, as a destination. The third section required no interpretation. Behavioral correlation, emails, internal messages, short instructions from Hudson that, taken alone, suggested efficiency. Taken together, they suggested awareness. Caroline paused at one message. Keep it consistent. Don't escalate. No explanation, no context, just direction. She noted the timestamp, then cross-referenced it with the corresponding expense. The alignment was exact. Of course it was. Patterns once formed do not misalign by accident. She closed the file, not because she was finished, because she had what she needed. Across the house, Hudson ended his call and stepped into the hallway. He did not check if she was awake. He did not need to. Their routines had separated enough that overlap was incidental. Long day, he said more to the space than to her. Caroline looked up from her laptop. Yes, she replied. He nodded, already moving past her. Tomorrow will be worse, he added. Not a complaint, a projection. Caroline watched him for a moment as he disappeared into another room. Worse, she thought, was relative. The following morning, the company moved again through its structured routine. But the internal systems had begun to tighten. IT issued a quiet notice: data preservation protocols, standard language, routine justification. No one outside of specific departments would question it. Inside those departments, it would be understood. Nothing was to be deleted, nothing altered, nothing moved without record. Caroline received confirmation from Margaret before noon. Preservation holds are active. No emphasis, no elaboration. That was enough. She acknowledged with a single reply. Understood. At the office, Hudson noticed the shift, but not its meaning. He saw the notices, the slight hesitation in responses. The way conversations paused when he entered, Theron resumed with adjusted language. He interpreted it as resistance, operational friction, something to be managed, not something already in motion beyond his control. Is there an issue? He asked his assistant standing at the edge of her desk. She looked up composed. Nothing formal, she said. Not untrue, not complete. Hudson accepted that, because it aligned with what he preferred to believe. Lydia, meanwhile, had begun to appear more frequently and more visibly. Not just in social settings, in proximity to operational spaces. She sat in on informal meetings, stayed after discussions that did not formally include her, asked questions framed as curiosity, but structured to signal familiarity. Some employees responded, others did not. But all of them noticed. Caroline noticed as well. Not Lydia's presence, the response to it. Which conversations adjusted, which did not. Which names appeared in follow-up emails, which did not. Patterns, always patterns. Ethan sent a second file that afternoon. Supplemental, audio. Caroline opened it without hesitation. The recording was clear, not staged, ambient. Voices layered with background noise, cutlery movement, low conversation. Then Hudson's voice. Just pour it. It's not complicated. A pause. Another voice softer. Caroline's. Not protesting, not questioning, acknowledging. The sound of liquid. Glass. Movement. Then Lydia. Thank you. Polite, measured. Followed by Hudson again. A laugh. Quiet. Contained. Caroline listened to the full recording, then played it again. Not for content, for clarity, for tone, for sequence. She saved the file, not separately, within the same structure as everything else. Margaret called that evening. Audio is clean, she said. Admissible. Caroline stood near the window, looking out at a city that continued without awareness. Understood, she replied. There's more, Margaret added. Access logs, security. Caroline waited. Late entries, off hours, repeated. Office, Caroline asked. Yes, aligned, yes. Caroline closed her eyes briefly, not from fatigue, from confirmation. Send them, she said. After the call ended, she remained where she was. Still, the evidence was no longer forming. It had formed, complete enough to proceed. Across town in a conference room that carried less ceremony than Hudson preferred. Richard Cole sat with two other board members. Files were open, printed, not digital, because some reviews required physical presence. You've seen this, one of them asked, tapping the report. Richard nodded. Preliminary, he said. Enough, the other replied. They did not speak in accusations. They spoke in thresholds. What's the recommendation, the first asked. Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at the documents, at the alignment, at the absence of ambiguity. Formal review, he said. Immediate. The others exchanged brief glances. No disagreement. Sequence had begun. Back at the house, Hudson poured himself a drink. Alone. He stood in the kitchen, glass in hand, scrolling through messages that required response. He paused at one. A request. Board level. Meeting. Special review. He frowned slightly. Not concern. Irritation. He typed a brief reply. Schedule it. Control, he believed, was maintained through engagement, through presence, through command. He did not consider that control, once challenged by structure, does not respond to tone. It responds to documentation. Caroline entered the room quietly. Not hiding, not announcing, just present. Hudson glanced up. Board wants a meeting, he said. Some procedural thing. Caroline met his gaze. Of course they do, she said. Hudson smiled faintly. Nothing serious, he added. Caroline did not respond. Because seriousness is not determined by belief. It is determined by evidence. And evidence, once aligned, does not require belief to proceed. She moved past him, setting her glass of water on the counter. No wine, no distraction, just clarity. Everything was in place. Emails, bank records, audio, access logs, sequence. The next step would not introduce new information. It would present what already existed, in a room designed, like all the others, to remove uncertainty. But this time, uncertainty would not be managed. It would be resolved. Caroline turned off the light as she left the kitchen. Behind her, Hudson remained where he was, unaware. Not because the signs were absent, because he had learned over time to ignore what did not align with his expectation. And expectation, when unchallenged for long enough, becomes its own form of blindness. The kind that does not notice structure shifting beneath it until it is required to stand on something that is no longer there. By the time the request for a special board meeting became formal, it no longer resembled a question. It was framed as procedure, but beneath the language, its purpose was already defined. The documentation had reached a point where delay would not protect the company. It would only expose it further. Hudson received the notice in the middle of a packed schedule between a call with investors and a strategy session that he had insisted remain uninterrupted. The subject line was measured neutral, constructed to avoid alarm. But the timing was deliberate. He read it once then and again more slowly. A formal review of executive conduct, attendance required, supporting documentation to be presented. Hudson leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression tightening just enough to register irritation. He was not concerned, not yet. In his experience, these kinds of processes were manageable. They existed to create the appearance of oversight, not to dismantle authority. "Schedule it for Friday," he told his assistant without looking up. "I'll clear an hour." His assistant hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "It's already set," she said. 2 hours. All board members confirmed. Hudson paused, not because of the length, because of the certainty. He nodded once. "Fine," he said. He returned to his screen, dismissing the matter as procedural friction, something to move through, not something that would alter the structure he believed he controlled. Across the building, the atmosphere had begun to shift in ways that were difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. Conversations shortened when he entered rooms, not out of fear, but out of recalibration. Language became more precise. Emails became more formal. Decisions that would have previously been routed directly to him now carried additional review layers. Hudson interpreted these changes as inefficiency, a breakdown in initiative. He did not consider that they were, in fact, a return to structure. Lydia Pierce noticed the change as well, though her interpretation was different. Where Hudson saw resistance, she saw instability, and within instability, opportunity. She adjusted quickly. Her presence in the office became more intentional, her interactions more visible. She positioned herself closer to Hudson during meetings, spoke when space allowed, and remained silent when interruption would have been noticed. She understood timing. She also understood that visibility, once established, needed to be maintained. "What's going on with the board?" she asked Hudson one evening, her tone light, as though the question carried no weight beyond casual curiosity. Hudson waved it off. "Nothing significant," he said. "Routine review. Someone overreacting to the dinner." Lydia smiled faintly. "They noticed," she said. Hudson looked at her, amused. "People always notice," he replied. "It doesn't mean anything." Lydia held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. But she filed the answer away. Because in her experience, what people noticed often meant more than what they said. At home, Caroline approached the situation from a different axis entirely. She did not wait for the meeting to define its direction. She reviewed the sequence one more time, not to gather new information, but to confirm alignment. Emails were categorized. Financial records were cross-referenced. Audio files were indexed. Security logs were annotated. Each element stood on its own, but more importantly, each element reinforced the others. There were no gaps, no inconsistencies, no reliance on interpretation. She sat at her desk, the light from her screen reflecting faintly against the window behind it, and opened the document Margaret had sent earlier that day. It was not a narrative. It was a structure, an outline of presentation, sequence of evidence, order of disclosure, the kind of preparation that did not seek to persuade, but to establish. Caroline read through it slowly, making no changes. It did not require them. Margaret had anticipated the same logic Caroline applied to everything else: begin with what cannot be disputed, then move toward what cannot be ignored. Ownership structure, financial records, behavioral evidence. Not emotional, not reactive, procedural. Caroline closed the document and leaned back slightly, allowing herself a moment not of hesitation, but of stillness. There was nothing left to prepare, only to proceed. The following day, Hudson attempted to regain what he perceived as the slipping control by increasing his visibility. He called additional meetings, inserted himself into decisions that had already been delegated, and began questioning processes that had functioned without issue for years. "What's the status on the compliance review?" he asked during a morning briefing, his tone sharper than usual. "It's ongoing," came the response. "Accelerate it," Hudson said. "I want everything cleared before Friday." There was a pause. "Some elements are external," the same voice replied. "We don't control the timeline." Hudson's jaw tightened slightly. "Then coordinate better," he said. The meeting moved on, but the shift was noted, not because of what he said, because of how. Pressure, when applied without understanding, often reveals more than it resolves. By mid-afternoon, confirmation of the meeting had reached all relevant parties. Richard Cole reviewed the final briefing documents in his office, the weight of the decision ahead not lost on him. He had seen companies survive far worse than this. He had also seen them unravel over far less. The difference, he knew, was not the severity of the issue. It was the response to it. He closed the folder and looked out over the city, his reflection faint against the glass. This would not be contained, not because it could not be managed, because it had already been documented. Across town, Caroline prepared in the same way she always did, quietly, without spectacle. She selected her documents, not in bulk, but in sequence. Each file labeled, each reference clear. There would be no searching, no hesitation. Everything would be where it needed to be when it was required. Her phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. "Board confirmed. Council present." Caroline read it once, then replied, "Understood." There was no further exchange. None was needed. That evening, Hudson returned home later than usual, his movements sharper, less controlled. He poured himself a drink without acknowledging Caroline, who was seated at the table reviewing a final set of notes. "They're making this bigger than it is," he said, more to himself than to her. Caroline looked up. "Are they?" she asked. Hudson exhaled a short, dismissive sound. "It's optics," he said. "It always is." Caroline studied him for a moment, not critically, not emotionally, but with the same attention she had applied to everything else. "Optics require alignment with reality," she said. Hudson laughed lightly. "Reality is what we present," he replied. Caroline did not respond immediately, because statements like that do not require correction. They require context, and context in this case was already prepared. She closed her folder and stood moving past him with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout. Hudson watched her as she left the room, something in her composure registering differently now than it had before. He could not name it, because it did not resemble resistance. It did not resemble submission either. It was something else, something structured. But he dismissed it the way he had dismissed other details that did not fit within his understanding. The meeting, he believed, would resolve everything. He would speak, clarify, reassert, restore order. What he did not understand was that order once challenged by documentation does not return to its previous state. It reorganizes. And when it does, it no longer responds to belief, only to what can be proven. The days leading up to the board meeting did not accelerate in the way Hudson expected them to. Instead of becoming more chaotic, more reactive, or more visibly tense, the company moved with an almost unsettling level of control. Processes continued, decisions were made, and communication remained intact, yet everything carried a different weight, as if each action was being observed from a distance, slightly removed from its usual rhythm. Hudson responded to this shift by increasing his presence. He arrived earlier, stayed later, and inserted himself into conversations that had previously unfolded without his direct involvement. His intention was not entirely conscious. It came from instinct, from a long-developed belief that authority was maintained through visibility and intervention. However, the effect was not what he intended. Where he expected reassurance, he encountered restraint. Where he expected alignment, he found careful neutrality. It was not resistance, at least not in any form that could be directly addressed. It was something more precise than that. People answered his questions, but they did so with language that closed rather than opened. They provided information, but only what had been requested, nothing more. They did not challenge him, but neither did they offer the unprompted deference he had grown accustomed to. Hudson interpreted this as inefficiency, as a breakdown in initiative that would need to be corrected after the board meeting concluded. He did not consider that it was in fact preparation not for him, but for what would take place in a room where his authority would no longer be assumed. At home, the atmosphere had become quieter, but not in a way that suggested avoidance. Caroline continued her routines with the same measured discipline, but there was a finality to her actions now that had not been present before. She no longer revisited documents repeatedly. She no longer adjusted timelines or reconsidered sequences. Everything had been set. Her health, however, did not adjust itself to her clarity. There were moments when the physical strain became more visible, when her movements slowed not by choice, but by necessity. She did not conceal it from herself, nor did she dramatize it. She acknowledged it, recorded it, and moved within its limits, without allowing it to dictate her direction. One afternoon, during a follow-up appointment, her doctor reviewed her recent data with the same careful tone that had characterized every previous consultation. "You're managing well," he said, though the phrasing carried more nuance than reassurance. Caroline listened as she always did without interrupting. "There will be fluctuations," he continued. "Some days will be more difficult than others." Caroline nodded. "I understand," she said. "What matters," he added, "is that you're not overextending yourself." Caroline considered that for a moment. "Define overextending," she said. The doctor paused, then offered a measured response. "Anything that places sustained stress on your system without recovery." Caroline absorbed that. Then she nodded once more. "Noted," she said. She did not explain her situation. She did not describe the meeting that was approaching, the structure that had already been set in motion, or the role she would play in it. None of that would have altered the medical advice, and she had no interest in blending one form of clarity with another. After the appointment, she returned home and reviewed her schedule for the following day. The board meeting was positioned in the middle of the afternoon, leaving the morning open assan, not for preparation, but for stability. She would need her energy not for speaking, but for presence. Hudson, meanwhile, had begun to feel a form of pressure he could not fully articulate. It was not fear, at least not in a way he would recognize as such. It was a disruption of expectation. Things were not aligning with the patterns he had relied on for years, and without those patterns, his usual methods of control felt less effective. That evening, he brought documents home: financial summaries, presentation notes, internal reports. He spread them across the dining table, reviewing them with increasing impatience. "They're overcomplicating this," he said, not looking up. "It's a conduct issue at most. It doesn't need this level of review." Caroline sat across from him, a glass of water placed within reach, her posture composed. "What level would be appropriate?" she asked. Hudson glanced at her briefly, then returned to the documents. Internal discussion, he said. Clarification. Move on. Caroline considered his answer. And if clarification reveals something else? She asked. Hudson exhaled a short, controlled release of breath. It won't, he said. The certainty in his voice was not based on evidence. It was based on assumption, the belief that what had not been challenged before would not be challenged now. Caroline did not dispute it. She did not need to. Instead, she reached for her own folder, closing it with a quiet, deliberate motion. Hudson noticed. "Are you planning to attend?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly as though the question had just occurred to him. "Yes," Caroline replied. He studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing through his expression. "This isn't necessary for you," he said. "It's internal." Caroline met his gaze steadily. "I'm aware," she said. Hudson leaned back in his chair, watching her more closely now. "You don't need to involve yourself," he continued. "I'll handle it." The statement carried the familiar weight of his authority, the assumption that resolution would follow from his intervention. Caroline held his gaze without resistance. "I know you will," she said. There was no contradiction in her tone, no agreement either, just acknowledgement. Hudson seemed satisfied with that, or at least willing to accept it as sufficient. He returned his attention to the documents, his focus narrowing once again to what he could control directly. Caroline remained where she was for a moment longer, then stood and moved toward the window. The city beyond it was unchanged, its movement constant, its systems operating without regard for individual narratives. It was a reminder of scale, of how structures function independently of perception. Behind her, Hudson continued reviewing his materials, unaware that the meeting he was preparing for was not structured around his presentation, his explanations, or his ability to reassert control. It was structured around documentation. And documentation does not respond to confidence. It responds to verification. Later that night, after Hudson had gone to bed, Caroline returned to the table and gathered her materials. She reviewed them once more, not to question their validity, but to confirm their order. Ownership records first, then financial alignment, then behavioral evidence. Each element placed deliberately, each transition designed to require no explanation beyond what was already contained within the documents themselves. She did not rehearse what she would say, because she did not intend to say much. Her role was not to argue. It was to present, to allow the structure she had built, maintained and documented, to become visible in a setting where it could no longer be overlooked. When she finished, she closed the folder and placed it beside her bag, ready for the morning. Then she turned off the light and stood in the quiet of the room for a moment, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window. There was no anticipation in her expression, no anxiety, only stillness, because everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion. The meeting would not create the outcome. It would reveal it. The boardroom was designed to neutralize emotion. Long table, balanced lighting, chairs spaced with intention rather than comfort. The kind of room where decisions were meant to feel procedural, even when they were not. Hudson entered first. Not early, but with the expectation that his arrival would still define the room. He greeted those already seated with the same measured confidence he had carried into every meeting of consequence. A nod to Richard Cole, a brief acknowledgement to the others. His presence, as always, was structured to suggest continuity. Control. He took his seat without hesitation, placed his folder on the table, adjusted at once, everything in its place. From his perspective, this meeting had already been resolved in principle. There would be questions. He would answer them. There would be concerns. He would reframe them. The structure would hold. Because it always had. Then the room continued to fill. Board members, one by one, then outside counsel. That he noted, but did not yet interpret. Margaret Ellis entered without announcement, her presence unadorned, her posture exact. She did not look toward Hudson when she took her seat. She placed her materials on the table, aligned them, and waited. Ethan Brooks followed. Laptop, minimal acknowledgement. no attempt to engage. Hudson's attention shifted slightly. Not concern, adjustment. This was more formal than he had anticipated, still manageable. He leaned back in his chair, allowing his expression to settle into something between patience and readiness. Then Caroline entered. There was no change in the room's structure, no visible shift in posture or tone. But something in the atmosphere, recalibrated, not dramatically, precisely. She walked to her seat without hesitation, placed her folder in front of her, and sat. No greeting, no announcement, just presence. Hudson glanced at her briefly. There was a flicker, something he could not fully categorize. Not defiance, not submission, something else. He dismissed it, because the meeting had already begun in his mind. Richard Cole cleared his throat slightly, a signal rather than a disruption. "Thank you all for attending," he said. His tone was neutral, deliberate. "This is a formal review regarding executive conduct and related matters. No names, not yet. We will proceed through documentation first," he continued. "Discussion will follow." Hudson nodded once. As expected, documentation. He had brought his own, prepared, structured. He was ready to explain. Margaret Ellis did not look at him. She opened her folder. Ethan connected his laptop. A screen at the far end of the room illuminated, not brightly, just enough. Initial review, Margaret said, her voice even controlled. Ownership structure. Hudson's attention sharpened slightly. Ownership, this was not the order he had anticipated. He remained still, listened. Margaret continued. Hale Strategic Holdings, she said, indicating the document displayed. Primary controlling entity. Hudson's name did not appear where he expected it to. He leaned forward slightly, not reacting, adjusting. This structure has remained consistent since initial formation, Margaret continued, with incremental consolidations over time. Ethan advanced the screen. Voting rights, control thresholds, activation conditions. Hudson's expression did not change, but his focus did, because something in the alignment was not what he had assumed. He glanced at Caroline. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the screen, calm, unmoved. Margaret continued without pause. Controlling interest, she said, is held through trust and holding structures under Caroline Hale. The room did not react immediately, because the statement required processing. Hudson blinked once. Slowly, not disbelief, recalculation. That's not, he began. Margaret did not interrupt him, but she did not stop either. Documentation is complete, she said. Filed, verified, active. Ethan advanced the screen again. Signatures, dates, clauses. Hudson's signature appeared. Repeatedly, on documents he had signed years ago. Without this understanding. He leaned back, then forward again. The movement was subtle, but contained something new, uncertainty. This doesn't change operational control, he said, his voice steady, measured. A statement, not yet a defense. Margaret met his gaze for the first time. It defines it, she said. No emphasis, no escalation, just precision. Silence settled across the table, not empty, waited. Richard Cole shifted slightly in his seat. Continue, he said. Margaret inclined her head once. Financial alignment, she said. Ethan moved to the next section. Bank records, expense reports, categorization patterns. Hudson's attention returned to the screen. Familiar entries, reframed, not as operations, as sequence. These entries, Ethan said, individually compliant, collectively inconsistent. He clicked. The timeline appeared. Aligned, clear. Associated locations, he continued. Another click. Addresses, leases, names. Lydia Pierce. There it was. Not introduced, revealed. Hudson's jaw tightened slightly. This is circumstantial, he said. Still controlled, still measured. Ethan did not respond to the characterization. He moved to the next screen. Emails. Hudson's voice. His words. Displayed. Reclassify under development. Keep it consistent. Don't escalate. No context, no explanation. Just instruction. Hudson looked at the screen, then away, then back again. Because once seen, alignment cannot be unseen. This is standard internal direction, he said. Margaret did not challenge the statement. She allowed it to exist, then placed the next element. Audio, she said. Ethan pressed play. The room filled with sound. Subtle, ambient. Then Hudson's voice. Just pour it. It's not complicated. A pause. Caroline's voice. Quiet, measured. Then Lydia. Thank you. Hudson did not move, but something in his posture shifted. Not outwardly, internally, because this was no longer interpretation. It was record. The audio ended. Silence returned. Different now, not procedural, conclusive. Richard Cole folded his hands. Is there any clarification you'd like to provide? He asked. Hudson looked at him, then at the documents, then at Caroline. She met his gaze this time, not with challenge, not with emotion, with certainty. And in that moment, Hudson understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. This was not a discussion. It was a structure, already complete, already aligned. He opened his mouth, closed it, because anything he said would not change what had already been established. Margaret spoke again. Recommendation, she said. Immediate review of executive authority and access, not removal, not yet. But the direction was clear. Richard nodded slowly. The other board members followed. No debate. Because debate requires ambiguity, and there was none. Hudson sat back in his chair, still, silent. For the first time since entering the room, he was not controlling the sequence. He was inside it, and it was moving forward without him. The room did not dissolve into chaos after the presentation concluded. There were no raised voices, no overlapping arguments, and no immediate declarations that would satisfy an expectation of dramatic collapse. Instead, the transition from exposure to consequence unfolded with a kind of procedural gravity that carried far more weight than any visible confrontation could have achieved. Richard Cole remained seated at the head of the table, his hands folded in front of him. His posture unchanged, yet the authority of his position now more apparent than before. He was not reacting to what had been presented. He was processing it within a framework that required response, not emotion. We will proceed with formal measures, he said, his tone steady and controlled. Effective immediately access to executive systems will be reviewed and restricted pending further determination. The phrasing was deliberate. It avoided accusation while establishing action. It did not require agreement from Hudson, nor did it seek it. Hudson remained still, his gaze directed toward the documents in front of him. For a moment it seemed as though he might respond, that he would reassert control through language, through presence, through the methods that had always worked before. But the structure of the situation had shifted beyond the reach of those methods. This is unnecessary, he said, finally, his voice measured, though the underlying tension was no longer fully contained. There's no indication of harm to the company. These are internal decisions, operational at most. Margaret Ellis did not interrupt him. She allowed him to complete the statement, to place it fully into the room where it could be considered not as defense, but as position. Then she responded. The issue is not harm, she said. It is fiduciary alignment. Her tone remained neutral, but the distinction was precise. Authority within this company is not defined by operational presence alone. It is defined by structure, by obligation, and by adherence to the terms that govern both. Hudson leaned slightly forward, his expression tightening. And you're suggesting I violated that, he asked. Margaret met his gaze without escalation. I'm stating that the documentation indicates a pattern that requires formal review, she said. Again, no accusation, but no retreat. Ethan Brooks adjusted his laptop slightly, bringing forward another set of documents: bank authorizations, approval chains, internal audit flags that had previously been categorized as minor irregularities. Several transactions, Ethan said, were approved without secondary oversight, despite exceeding internal thresholds that would normally require it. Hudson's attention shifted back to the screen. "Those thresholds are flexible," he said. "They're designed to accommodate executive discretion." Ethan nodded once. "They are," he replied, "within defined parameters." He paused, allowing the next words to settle with clarity. "These transactions fall outside those parameters." The distinction was not argumentative. It was structural. Hudson did not respond immediately, because the conversation was no longer about interpretation. It was about alignment with systems that existed independently of his authority. Richard Cole turned slightly toward the rest of the board. "We are not here to determine intent," he said. "We are here to determine compliance." The room remained quiet, not uncertain, resolved. Caroline sat without movement, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture unchanged from the moment she had entered the room. She had not spoken since the presentation began, and yet her presence was not passive. It was central not because she asserted it, but because everything that had been presented traced back to structures she had established and maintained over time. Hudson looked at her again, this time with a different awareness. Not of her silence, of its context. He began to understand, not fully but enough to unsettle the certainty he had relied on, that this had not been constructed in response to recent events. It had been built long before, embedded into the foundation of the company in ways he had never examined closely enough to recognize. "This doesn't change the fact that I've been running this company successfully for years," he said, his voice quieter now, less performative, more contained. No one disagreed, because success as a metric was not under review. Margaret responded with the same measured clarity. "No one is disputing operational outcomes," she said. "The question is whether those outcomes have been achieved within the framework that governs them." Hudson leaned back, his gaze shifting briefly toward the far end of the room, as if searching for a point of reference that no longer aligned with his position. "And if they haven't," he asked. Richard answered this time. "Then corrective action is required," he said. There was no emphasis, no escalation, just process. A document was placed in front of Hudson, not slid across the table dramatically, placed, aligned. "Temporary suspension of executive access," Richard said, "pending full review." Hudson looked at the document, then at Richard. "This is premature," he said. "It is procedural," Richard replied. The distinction held. Hudson's hand remained still on the table. He did not reach for the document immediately, because to sign it would be to acknowledge the structure he had resisted recognizing. To refuse would not change the structure, only his position within it. Margaret spoke again, her tone unchanged. "This is not a removal," she said. "It is a measure to preserve integrity during review." Hudson exhaled slowly, the controlled release of breath carrying more weight now than it had earlier in the meeting. Integrity. The word lingered in the room, not as judgment, as standard. He reached for the pen, not abruptly, not reluctantly, deliberately. He read the document once, though the content was already clear. Then he signed. The movement was precise, practiced unchanged in form. But its meaning was entirely different. Ethan closed his laptop. Margaret gathered her files. The board members remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the action to settle into the structure of the meeting. Caroline did not move. Not yet, because the sequence was not complete. Richard looked toward her. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his tone carrying a different kind of acknowledgement, now one that aligned with the information that had been formally recognized. "If you have anything to add." Caroline met his gaze. For a moment the room held its breath, not in anticipation of confrontation, but in recognition that this was the first time she would speak within the formal structure that had just been redefined. "I don't," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, without emphasis, because everything that needed to be said had already been documented. Richard nodded once. "Understood," he said. There were no further questions, no additional statements. Because the process had moved from presentation to action, and action did not require elaboration. Hudson remained seated as the others began to stand, his position unchanged, yet entirely altered. His access would be restricted, his authority reviewed. His assumptions, those that had remained unchallenged for years, had now been placed within a framework that did not recognize them. Caroline stood. Not abruptly, not ceremonially. She gathered her folder, ensuring each document was in its place, then turned toward the door. She did not look at Hudson, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to exchange. The conversation, such as it was, had already occurred. Through records, through structure, through time. As she walked out of the room, the weight of what had taken place did not follow her as burden. It settled behind her within the systems that would now carry it forward. Hudson remained where he was for a moment longer, the signed document still in front of him, the pen resting exactly where he had placed it. For the first time, the space around him did not respond to his presence. It held its own, and he was no longer at the center of it. The shift from decision to consequence did not require announcement. It moved through systems, quietly, precisely. By the time Hudson left the boardroom, the changes had already begun to take effect. His access credentials, once unrestricted, were no longer absolute. Certain files would not open. Certain systems required secondary authorization. Meetings he had scheduled were reassigned or placed under review without explanation. There was no single moment that marked the transition. No visible line, just absence where access had once been assumed. Hudson walked through the office with the same posture he had always maintained, but the responses he encountered had altered in ways that could not be directly addressed. People greeted him. They nodded. They responded when spoken to. But something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer aligning around him. They were aligning around process. He entered his office and closed the door, not forcefully, but with intention. The room remained as it had always been organized, controlled, reflective of a structure he had shaped over time. But the control it represented no longer extended beyond its walls. He moved to his desk, opened his laptop, and attempted to access a set of financial reports. Access denied. The message was neutral, procedural. He tried again, same result. Hudson leaned back in his chair, his expression still composed, but the underlying tension now unmistakable. This was not resistance. It was enforcement. Across the building, the compliance team had already initiated formal review protocols. Documentation was being secured, accounts were being examined, and communication channels were being monitored with a level of precision that did not allow for improvisation. Margaret Ellis coordinated with external counsel, ensuring that every step taken aligned with both corporate governance and legal requirement. There were no shortcuts, no assumptions. Each action was recorded, justified, and placed within a framework that would withstand scrutiny. Caroline did not involve herself in the operational execution of these processes. She did not need to. Her role had been to establish the structure that made them possible. Now that structure was active. She returned home in the late afternoon, her movements measured, her energy conserved. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a shift rather than precedes one. She placed her folder on the table, not opening it, not reviewing it again. There was nothing left to confirm. Her phone rang. Margaret. "It's in motion," Margaret said. Caroline listened. "Access restrictions are active," Margaret continued. "Compliance review has begun. External counsel is engaged." Caroline moved toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass. "And Hudson?" she asked. Aware, Margaret replied. "Not aligned." Caroline considered that. He would not align, not immediately. That was expected. "Next steps," Caroline asked. "Board resolution within 48 hours, Margaret said. "Formal determination of authority and responsibility." Caroline nodded. "I understand." Margaret paused briefly. "Personal proceedings?" she asked. Caroline's gaze remained steady. "Proceed," she said. There was no hesitation, no escalation, just sequence. "Understood," Margaret replied. The call ended. Caroline remained where she was for a moment longer, not reflecting, not reconsidering, simply allowing the transition from one phase to the next to settle into place. Across the city, Lydia Pierce began to understand that the structure she had been moving toward no longer existed in the form she had anticipated. Her messages to Hudson went unanswered at first. Not ignored, delayed, then brief, then absent. She attempted to access the office later that evening, expecting the same ease of entry she had grown accustomed to. Her access badge did not respond. The light remained red. She tried again. No change. A security officer approached, polite, composed. "Access has been updated," he said. No explanation, no elaboration. Lydia smiled, controlled, unaffected. "Of course," she replied. But the understanding was immediate. Proximity without structure does not sustain itself. Hudson, meanwhile, attempted to regain position through action. He made calls. Some were answered, some were not. Those that were answered carried a different tone. Measured, careful, non-committal. He spoke with urgency, with clarity, with the same confidence he had always relied on. But confidence without alignment does not produce the same result. "Just a review," he said to one board member. "It will be resolved." The response was neutral. "We'll follow the process." The word appeared again. Repeated, unyielding. Hudson ended the call and stood in the center of his office, the space that had once reinforced his authority now reflecting something else. Limitation. He moved to the window, looking out over the city as he had done countless times before. But this time, the view did not respond to him. It remained distant, unchanged, because what had shifted was not the environment. It was his position within it. That evening, he returned home earlier than expected. Caroline was in the living room, seated, a book open in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her expression unchanged. "We need to talk," Hudson said. It was not a request, but it no longer carried the same weight. Caroline closed the book, placing it beside her. "Yes," she said. Hudson stood across from her, not sitting as though remaining upright would preserve something of his position. "They've overreached," he said. "This is temporary." Caroline met his gaze. "Is it?" she asked. Hudson exhaled a controlled release of tension. "You know how these things work," he said. "Procedure, optics. It will settle." Caroline remained still. "You signed the documents," she said. It was not a question. Hudson paused. "Yes," he said, "because it was necessary to move forward." Caroline nodded once. "And now it will," she replied. The statement was simple, not confrontational, but final. Hudson watched her, something in her tone registering more clearly now than before. Not resistance, not agreement, completion. "You're not concerned?" he asked. Caroline considered the question, then answered. No, there was no elaboration, no explanation, because concern would imply uncertainty, and there was none. Hudson remained standing for a moment longer, then turned away, moving toward the hallway without another word. The conversation had not escalated. It had not needed to, because what had been set in motion did not rely on dialogue. It relied on structure, on record, on process. Caroline picked up her book again, opening it to the page she had left. Not because she was distracted, because she was no longer required to act. The systems she had built, the documentation she had maintained, the timing she had controlled, all of it was now functioning independently. Justice in this form did not arrive as confrontation. It arrived as sequence. And sequence, once complete, does not reverse. The house no longer held the same structure it once had, though nothing visible had changed. The furniture remained in place. The lighting unchanged, the quiet carefully preserved. Yet the alignment within it had shifted not through disruption, but through absence. What had once been shared space now felt segmented, defined less by walls than by direction. Caroline moved through it without hesitation. Not as someone reclaiming it, as someone concluding her time within it. The decision had not been made in a single moment. It had formed gradually shaped by observation, reinforced by documentation, and finalized not by emotion, but by clarity. There was no confrontation left to initiate. No conversation that would alter what had already been established. She began with the practical. A suitcase placed on the bed, not large, not symbolic, sufficient. She selected what was necessary with the same precision she applied to everything else. Clothing chosen for function, not memory. Documents already prepared, already organized. Personal items limited to those that carried meaning independent of the house itself. There was no hesitation in what she left behind, because what remained did not belong to her in the way it once might have. Ownership, she understood, was not defined by presence. It was defined by structure, and the structure that mattered existed elsewhere. Downstairs, Hudson sat at the dining table, the same place where he had reviewed documents only nights before, his confidence still intact, his assumptions still unchallenged. Now the table held nothing but a single glass, half on full, untouched. He had spent the morning in conversation. Calls, messages, attempts to reestablish alignment. Some had been returned, others had not. Each response carried the same tone, measured, careful, procedural. No one had confronted him directly. No one had accused him, but no one had restored what had been removed either. Control, once filtered through process, does not return through insistence. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, looked up, watched as she descended, her movement, steady, her posture unchanged. "You're leaving," he said. It was not a question. Caroline paused at the base of the stairs, meeting his gaze. "Yes," she replied. Hudson studied her for a moment, as though searching for something that had been present before and was now absent. "This is temporary," he said. "You don't need to." Caroline did not interrupt him. She allowed the sentence to complete, allowed the assumption within it to settle into the space between them. "I'm not responding to temporary conditions," she said. "I'm responding to what has already been established." Hudson leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "This can be resolved," he said. "It's a process." Caroline nodded once. "It is," she agreed. There was no contradiction in her tone. Because she understood the process, had built it, maintained it, activated it. "And the process will continue," she added. Hudson exhaled, his frustration now visible, though still controlled. "You're making this final," he said. Caroline held his gaze. "No," she replied. "It already is." Silence followed, not heavy, not charged, simply complete. Hudson looked away, first his attention shifting toward the window, toward a view that no longer aligned with his position. Caroline moved past him, placing her keys on the table beside the glass. The gesture was quiet, deliberate, not symbolic, just accurate. "I've arranged for the transfer of personal accounts," she said. "Everything is documented." Hudson did not respond, because documentation in this context did not invite discussion. It concluded it. She turned toward the door, her suitcase already placed beside it. Her movements were unhurried, not because time was abundant, but because urgency was unnecessary. Everything that required action had already been completed. As she reached for the handle, Hudson spoke again. "Caroline." She paused, not turning immediately. Then, slowly, she did what she asked. The question was neutral, open. Hudson hesitated. For a moment, the language that had always come easily to him did not arrive in the same form. "There was no need for this to happen like this," he said. Caroline considered his words, not dismissing them, not accepting them, examining them. "It didn't happen suddenly," she replied. Her tone remained calm, but the distinction was clear. "This has been forming for a long time." Hudson shook his head slightly. "That's not what I mean." Caroline waited. Because meaning, when not stated clearly, requires space to surface. Hudson looked at her, his expression no longer confident, no longer structured, but searching. "You could have said something," he said. Caroline held his gaze. "I did," she replied. Not defensively, not sharply, just fact, when it mattered. Hudson's brow tightened slightly, as though the statement required effort to reconcile with his memory. But memory, Caroline knew, is often shaped by attention. And attention over time had not been directed toward her. She did not elaborate, because explanation would not change recognition, and recognition in this moment was no longer necessary. "I'm not leaving to make a point," she said. "I'm leaving because the point has already been made." Hudson said nothing, because there was nothing left to counter. Caroline turned back to the door, opened it. The air outside was cooler, sharper, carrying a clarity that the house no longer held. She stepped out her suitcase, following the sound of its movement quiet against the ground. Behind her, the door remained open for a moment longer, not as invitation, as transition. Then it closed, not forcefully, not slowly, just enough. Hudson remained inside, standing in a space that had not changed physically but had lost something essential. Not presence, structure. Because what had sustained it, what had organized it, stabilized it, defined it, had never been visible in the way he had understood. And now that it was gone, the absence could not be filled by assumption. Caroline walked without looking back. Not because she was avoiding the past, but because she had already accounted for it. Ahead of her, the city continued, as it always had, its systems intact, its movement constant, its structures indifferent to individual narratives. She did not move towards something undefined. She moved within a framework she'd already established. One that did not require recognition to function. One that did not rely on performance. One that held, and would continue to hold, without her needing to remain where it had once been overlooked. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They settled, gradually, systematically, without spectacle. In the days following the board's decision, the company did not collapse, nor did it fracture in any visible way. Operations continued. Projects moved forward. Employees reported to work, completed tasks, and responded to directives that now came through revised channels. Stability, at least from the outside, remained intact. But within that stability, alignment had changed. Authority no longer flowed through Hudson. It moved through structure, through interim leadership appointed by the board, through compliance oversight, through processes that had always existed but had now been activated with precision. Hudson's name remained on records, but his function had been suspended. His access was restricted not only to systems, but to influence. Meetings proceeded without him. Decisions were made without his input. Communication no longer required his approval. He had not been removed entirely, but he had been separated. And separation in a system defined by connection is a form of absence that cannot be ignored. At first, he attempted to reinsert himself. He sent messages, requested updates, proposed meetings. Some responses came. Most did not. Those that did were structured, carefully acknowledging receipt without granting engagement. "We'll follow the current process. We'll update you when appropriate. Please coordinate through council." Each phrase carried the same underlying message. He was no longer central. He was peripheral. And peripheral roles do not command. They observe. Lydia Pierce, who had once moved confidently within the edges of that same structure, found herself outside it entirely. Her calls went unanswered. Her access revoked. Her presence, once tolerated for its proximity to Hudson, now carried no relevance. She attempted briefly to re-establish contact, to clarify, to reframe, to position herself within a narrative that no longer included her. But narratives, like structures, depend on alignment. And she no longer had it. Within a week, her name stopped appearing in internal conversations altogether. Not erased, simply no longer necessary. Caroline, meanwhile, did not return to the office. Her absence was not interpreted as withdrawal. It was understood as transition. The board, through Richard Cole, reached out once, not to request her involvement, but to acknowledge it. "Your documentation has provided clarity," he said during a brief call. Caroline listened. "That was its purpose," she replied. Richard paused. "There are decisions ahead regarding long-term governance," he said. "Your input would be—" Caroline did not interrupt him, but when he finished, she answered with the same measured clarity she had maintained throughout. "I trust the structure," she said. It was not dismissal. It was completion, Richard understood. They ended the call without further discussion. Caroline's days shifted into a different rhythm. Not slower, not easier, just different. Her health required attention that she had previously managed alongside everything else. Now she allowed it space, not as priority over everything, but as part of a structure that no longer required her constant oversight elsewhere. She attended her appointments, followed her treatment, documented her progress. The discipline remained. Only the context had changed. There were moments brief and unremarkable when she reflected not on what had happened, but on what had been understood too late by others. Not with regret, not with satisfaction, simply with recognition. That silence, when maintained with intention, is not absence. It is observation. And observation, when supported by record, becomes structure. Hudson's situation evolved more slowly. The formal review extended into weeks, then into a process that required legal interpretation, compliance verification, and governance restructuring. His role, once assumed to be permanent, was now subject to terms he had never fully considered. He met with counsel, reviewed documents, attempted to reconstruct a narrative in which his actions aligned with acceptable boundaries. But documentation does not respond to narrative. It responds to consistency. And the consistency in this case did not favor him. There were no dramatic consequences, no public statements, no visible collapse. Instead, there was adjustment, gradual, complete. By the time the final determinations were reached, Hudson's position had been formally altered. He was no longer CEO. The transition was presented as restructuring, as strategic realignment, as part of a broader organizational evolution. Language designed to contain impact, to preserve stability. But beneath that language, the reality remained unchanged. He no longer led the company. He no longer defined its direction. He remained connected to it, only through what could not be removed, without dismantling the structure itself. And even that connection was limited. Caroline did not attend the final meeting. She received the outcome in writing, read it once, then set it aside. Not because it lacked importance, because it required no further action from her. The system had completed what it was designed to do. One afternoon, weeks later, she stood by a window in a smaller apartment, one chosen not for status, but for clarity. The space was simple structured, aligned with what she needed, rather than what others expected. Understood. Outside, the city continued its movement unchanged by the narratives that had unfolded within it. Caroline held a cup of tea in her hands, the warmth steady grounding. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction in the outcome beyond its accuracy. Because what had occurred was not a reversal of power. It was a correction, a realignment of what had always been true with what had finally been recognized. Hudson, somewhere else in that same city, continued to adjust to a position he had never anticipated. Not through collapse, through limitation, through the quiet understanding that what he had believed to be control had in fact been conditional, and that the conditions had been defined long before he thought to question them. Caroline did not follow his trajectory. She did not observe his adjustment, because her path had diverged completely, not away from him, away from the structure that had once required her to remain. She placed the cup down on the table beside her and turned away from the window. There were still things to manage, still decisions to make, but they were hers, not reactive, not corrective, constructive. And that difference, though not visible from the outside, defined everything that followed. She moved through the space without hesitation, her step steady, her posture unchanged. Not because nothing had happened, because everything had. And it had resolved. Not through confrontation, not through noise, but through record, through structure, through time. In the end, what remains is rarely the moment itself. It is the pattern that led to it, the quiet decisions made long before anyone thought they mattered, the details recorded when no one was watching, the discipline to observe instead of react, to document instead of argue, to wait until structure, not emotion, can speak. Caroline did not raise her voice. She did not demand recognition. She did not return humiliation with humiliation. And yet everything was seen. Everything was accounted for. Everything was resolved. There is a kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not need witnesses to validate it. It exists in restraint and clarity, in the ability to stand still while everything else reveals itself. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've seen what that looks like. Not dramatic, not loud, but lasting. If this kind of story resonates with you, you can let it be known in a quiet way through a like, or by sharing your thoughts below. And if you want more stories that move like this slowly and deliberately, you're always welcome to stay connected. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one that never needed to speak loudly at all.